I have now made 3 videos about Civil War generals, 2 about what Confederate generals did after the war, and 2 about what Union generals did after the war. These videos have been my most popular by quite a margin, so today I will be using Abdus VGC's idea, which he/she suggested on 2 of my 3 Civil War general videos, and tell the story of 7 generals who originally hailed from the South but remained loyal to the Union. Here are their stories. George H. Thomas. George H. Thomas was a Virginian, but was a staunch Southern Unionist who sided with the U.S. Army after his home state left the Union. He won one of the Union's first battles at Mill Springs, and is fondly remembered for his strong defense at the Battle of Chickamauga. In 1864, he won the Union one of their most important victories, as he decimated his former student General Hood's army at the Battle of Nashville. Despite Thomas's success, he is often less remembered than other generals such as Grant and Sherman due to his lack of competitive edge. He regularly passed on promotions he felt he was not ready for, and did not write memoirs detailing his achievements like many other Civil War generals. After the war, Thomas worked for the Department of the Cumberland in various different states, and worked to ensure freed slaves were treated with dignity and respect. He was eventually considered for the role of General-in-Chief of the Army, but asked his name be removed from the nominations, as he had no interest in politics. He instead worked in the Pacific branch of the U.S. Army in California, where he would die of a stroke in 1870. Not a single blood relative of Thomas's attended his funeral, as they never forgave him for betraying the Confederacy. John Gibbon. John Gibbon was born in Pennsylvania, but moved to North Carolina aged 11. He served during the Mexican-American War, but never saw combat, and worked hard to maintain peace between the Seminole Indians and settlers in southern Florida. Gibbon was stationed in Utah when the Civil War broke out, and despite the fact that his family owned slaves, and 3 of his brothers, 2 of his brother-in-laws, and his cousin joined the Confederate Army, Gibbon remained loyal to the Union. Gibbon was given command of a brigade of volunteers and became known as the Iron Brigade, after General Hooker said Gibbon's men fought like iron during their uphill charge at the Battle of South Mountain. On the final day of the Battle of Gettysburg, Gibbon's men faced the brunt of Pickett's charge, where Gibbon was injured and forced to leave the front lines for some time. Upon Gibbon's return, he joined General Grant's overland campaign and most notably blocked the Confederates' escape route during the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse, which forced General Lee to surrender. Gibbon was present at Lee and Grant's meeting in the courthouse. After the war, Gibbon was made a colonel and sent to the West to fight in the American Indian Wars. He was close by when General Custer died at Little Bighorn and arrived shortly after the battle ended to bury the dead and evacuate the wounded. Gibbon served in the Army until 1891 and would pass away 5 years later in Baltimore. In 1988, on the 125th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, a bronze statue was dedicated to General Gibbon in Gettysburg National Military Park. Multiple towns have been named after General Gibbon, such as Gibbon, Minnesota, Gibbonsville, Idaho, Gibbon, Oregon, Gibbon, Nebraska, Gibbon, Washington, as well as Gibbon River and Gibbon Falls in Yellowstone National Park. John Buford. John Buford was born in Kentucky, but raised in Illinois, and was raised by a prominent Democrat father who was a political opponent of Lincoln. Buford's grandfather had also served under General Lee's father in the American Revolutionary War. Despite this, after the war broke out, Buford remained loyal to the Union. He was reportedly sent a letter by the governor of Kentucky promising riches and glory if he returned to the South and joined the Confederacy, but replied, "I am a captain in the United States Army and intend to remain one." General Buford served at the Second Battle of Bull Run and personally led a charge late in the battle, but was shot in the knee and wounded. Some newspapers reported that he had been killed, but in reality the wound was minor. Buford served as cavalry chief under General McClellan, where he fought in the battles of South Mountain and Antietam. At the Battle of Gettysburg, Buford chose a field that would be used as the battleground, and while in town, gained word of how strong the approaching Confederate force was, and made strategic defensive moves that played a huge part in the Union's strategic victory. By December 1863, Buford fell very ill, and it was clear his time was short. President Lincoln, upon hearing of Buford's imminent death, promoted him to Major General, a title Buford was proud to hold in his final hours. He passed away in the afternoon of December 16, 1863, likely due to typhoid. Buford was immortalized in a statue on the Gettysburg battlefield and was the namesake for Buford, Wyoming, a now uninhabited town. David Farragut. David Farragut, born James Farragut, was the son of a Spanish-born seaman who served in the Revolution and a Scottish-Irish homemaker. He was born near Knoxville, Tennessee, and moved to New Orleans as a child. At the age of 11, Farragut's mother died, and his father sent Farragut to live with David Porter, a U.S. naval officer who Farragut's father had served with in the Revolution. It was at this point that Farragut changed his name from James to David in honor of his new foster father. By the age of 9, Farragut was a seaman serving under his foster father during the War of 1812. He took part in the capture of the HMS Alert, and by the age of 11 was tasked with bringing a captured ship, the Essex, to safety, a mission which saw him wounded in a skirmish near Chile. He would later fight pirates in the West Indies and serve in the Mexican-American War. By the start of the Civil War, Farragut was 60 years old with 51 years of naval experience under his belt. Farragut was living in the South in the early 1860s, but made his voice very clear that he regarded secession to be treason. In the few months preceding the war, as secession seemed more and more likely, Farragut moved to New York with his wife and made it clear to Union leaders that his allegiance stood with them. Farragut was tasked with capturing his old childhood home, New Orleans. After winning the Battle of Forts Jackson and St. Philip, New Orleans fell, and Farragut moved up the Mississippi, participating in the siege of Fort Hudson. Farragut also successfully took Mobile Bay, the last major Confederate stronghold in the Gulf of Mexico. Farragut remained on active naval duty until 1870, where he would pass away from a heart attack while on vacation in New Hampshire. He is buried in New York City. Winfield Scott. Winfield Scott is often considered one of the greatest American generals to serve. He was born in Virginia and joined the Army in 1808, serving in the War of 1812, Mexican-American War, and multiple conflicts with Native Americans. He worked his way up the ranks until becoming the commanding general of the U.S. Army in 1841. He held that position for 20 years, the longest that position was ever held. And by the beginning of the Civil War, Scott had served in the U.S. Army for more than 50 years, so his loyalty clearly lied with the Union. In the early months of the Civil War, he served as an extremely important advisor to Lincoln, most notably suggesting the successful Anaconda Plan, which blocked Confederate supply lines and trapped Confederate troops. He retired in 1861 and passed away in 1866. Although his time in the Civil War was short, it would prove to be very successful. Robert Anderson. Robert Anderson was born in 1805 in Louisville, Kentucky, and by the beginning of the Civil War had spent 36 years in the Army and had fought in the Mexican-American War, as well as multiple wars against Native Americans. Anderson was in charge of Fort Sumter in the Charleston Harbor, and when South Carolina seceded, Anderson remained loyal to the Union, despite being a Southerner and former slave owner. Once the Confederate Army was formed, President Davis ordered for Fort Sumter to be captured, so a Confederate force led by General Beauregard fired upon and eventually captured Fort Sumter. Despite the fact that General Anderson lost the battle and the South captured Fort Sumter, he was heavily outnumbered and praised as a national hero for his defense of the fort. After his service at Fort Sumter, General Anderson was sent to Kentucky to recruit Unionists for the cause, but was removed from command in 1861. Historians debate on whether he was removed from command due to his failing health or Lincoln's dislike of General Anderson. He was put in charge of Fort Adams in Rhode Island, but retired from the Army in 1863. Anderson was very ill in his old age, and apart from some administrative work, spent much time at home. In 1869, Anderson moved to France in search of a cure for his ailments, where he would pass away just 2 years later. His likeness is carved into a monument located in Charleston Harbor. William Harney. William Harney was born in Madison, Tennessee in 1800 and joined the Army in 1818. He served in the Mexican-American War, Pig War, Utah War, and various conflicts with natives. The Lakota Indians nicknamed Harney Woman Killer and Mad Bear due to his ruthlessness. The name Woman Killer came from an incident in 1834 in which Harney beat an enslaved woman named Hannah so brutally she died. Harney was charged with murder, and despite the fact that all evidence pointed towards Harney's guilt, he was acquitted. At the outbreak of the Civil War, Harney was stationed in St. Louis, Missouri, and found himself in quite the predicament. Missouri's governor supported secession and began scheming with Confederate officials to secede, but a majority of Missouri's residents, including Harney, wanted to remain loyal to the Union. Harney negotiated with all sides and managed to come to a compromise, which kept Missouri in the Union. Despite this, Lincoln doubted Harney's loyalty to the North due to the fact that he was a slave-owning Missouri resident native to Tennessee. Due to this, Harney was removed from command and ordered to go to Washington. Along the way, Harney was captured by Confederate forces and offered a position serving under General Lee. Harney declined the offer and was set free by the Confederates due to his Southern heritage. Upon his arrival in Washington, Harney was assigned various administrative jobs, and once it became clear he would not be sent to the field again, he retired in 1863 and moved back to St. Louis. In the late 1860s, Harney came out of retirement to serve on the Indian Peace Commission, where he surprisingly urged the U.S. government to honor their past treaties. He then retired to Mississippi, where he spent lots of time reminiscing with his old friend and comrade, Jefferson Davis. Harney and Davis had served together at Fort Crawford before the war. After Davis passed away, Harney moved to Orlando, where he would eventually pass away in 1889, aged 88. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to subscribe and leave a like, as it really does help. And feel free to let me know in the comments any future ideas you guys would like to see. I'm always looking for new ideas, and I'm happy to take some advice.